departing into darkness, wants most desperately to leave his visible mark on the world. Here, I was here. A human diary, a chain of knowledge that connects everyone to everyone else. All our faith, passion, and skill, all the horror and beauty of the generations past, are left for us to ponder. We fight, love, build, and destroy, and write that history on stone, on clay, on paper. And then invent the book, a device like the wheel, difficult to improve. Yet we developed bright new technologies, 60 million words on a single disk, the library of the world in your home. But the irony of progress is that it sometimes moves backward.
The fact is that we're moving in uncharted waters. We're dealing with one of the fundamental assets of society, that is recorded information. There's a real risk in taking something that works and transforming it in a way that's more responsive to fads and to technological wizardry without thinking through the fundamental implications that those changes will make on a system that is at the heart of civilization.
Vienna, the crossroad of history, the treasure city of an aging empire, the shock point of East and West, whose streets have echoed with the armored horses of the Crusades, the home of Mahler, of Schiller and Freud, city of monuments and palaces, of luxury, genius, and decay. Here, from around the world, from India, Belgium, Senegal, from Brazil, China, Morocco, from Poland, from the United States, came delegates to an urgent meeting, the first such consultation in history. From 43 countries they came. In the next few days, they would transcend the often bitter divisions of race, culture, caste, religion, nation, and ideology. For they were united in a new and frightening recognition that in every nation, in every culture, the fortune of the past in books and paper is disappearing. They had come to assemble in the Great Hall of the Austrian National Library. They had come, 109 delegates, to consider urgent remedies for a universal crisis. Harvard, founded in 1639, more than a century before the American Republic, with a gift of 150 books, now grown to 7 million. Widener Library, the main research library. Here, Nobel Prize winners roamed the open stacks, historians re-evaluating the past, scientists looking to see what other scientists had already done, statesmen, graduate students, finding here the blocks with which to build in their turn the inverted and precarious pyramid of human knowledge. Yet, month by month and year by year, these precious volumes are burning away with insidious, slow fires. The New York Public Library, where immigrants from every continent climb the long stairway to read without charge the details of our democracy. In a house of stone meant to last out the centuries, but the stone itself was corrupted by acid rain and polluted air. And inside, millions of books are victims of a chemical disease. John Baker, Chief of Conservation.
We have miles of books in our stacks, and they're all lined up very neatly on the shelf. Shelf after shelf, And they really don't look so bad. But when you open them, many of them are so brittle and deteriorated that they simply fall apart in your hands. The paper is silently disintegrating, and the intellectual record of the last 150 years is in danger of disappearing.
Books and the hunger for books went west with the guns and cooking pots and furniture on the wagons. At Berkeley, California, too, among the millions of bound volumes, science, history, fiction, drama, poetry, the annals of medicine, and the codes of law, the silent disease is growing. On almost every page printed since the middle of the 19th century. The Library of Congress, the splendid guardian not only of history and its crucial documents, but of the most ordinary books, newspapers, letters, and diaries, the cumulative daily life of the nation, invaluable and irreplaceable. Yet even here, inside this shell of splendid masonry, millions of volumes are falling apart inside their covers, and within the very fortress meant to preserve them.
A number of years ago, we knew somehow instinctively that we had a problem in preservation, but we didn't know really the extent of it. So we had a survey made of our collections and discovered, much to my horror, that 25% of our book collections of 13 million books, 25% were embrittled. That means they would crumble. More seriously, we discovered that 77,000 volumes a year moved from a highly acidic state into that embrittled state. This is a book taken from our collections, which shows the condition that I've described, the embrittlement. You can see what happens when you do that to it.
7 million books in the Library of Congress are disintegrating now. Many millions in all the libraries of this world, not to mention in the third world. In the third world is catastrophic because they don't have even minimal resources to preserve their heritage. So America, Europe, Soviet Union, all of us share this problem. And we're responsible for our brethren's and our sisters' cultures, because scholarship is universal. Scholarship cannot be nationalistic. Science is universal. So if some suffer, some disappear, the core of creativity of mankind will disappear.
What is unique about a book is that one can hold it like a hand in one's hands. It secretes a warmth, the proof of a hidden life. One has only to open the pages, and here is a stranger becoming a friend. It speaks, and we hear the voice of an Einstein. I want to know God's thoughts. Or an Emily Dickinson. The opening and the close of being are alike, or differ if they do, as bloom upon a stalk. Or a Whitman, when lilacs last in the doorway bloomed. And the Old Testament, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. But equally, there are books by fools and lunatics, vain and disputatious men, liars and famous criminals. The sun and shadow of the world are reflected in the white and black of these thin, fragile pages. There are wonders recorded in every book, divine and human. But the greatest magic of all is the transmission between the tiny scratch of letters through 12 inches of empty air into the eye, the opening to the mind of man. Such is the book I hold in my hands. What is endangered here, if any book rots from within, is a piece of the history of the human race. or Dickens or Darwin or Thoreau, mind crosses to mind. To a law student, an inventor, a musicologist. To a medical researcher, an engineer, an astronomer. To a political scientist, a mathematician, an economist. Mind crosses to mind. To a novelist whose work is based on the rich materials of human history, James Michener.
It would be very difficult for a group of 3 people to sit down and think up some subject to write about on which there was no information whatever. The men and women of this world have been very bright people sometimes. German scholars, English clergymen, Russian philosophers, French thinkers. They have written about everything. I have never looked at a subject, and boy, I've had a pretty wide scatter of subjects. I have never looked at one, but what some very bright person a long time ago also looked at it, laid out his data, and provided her insights. And there they all are in the books of the world. And I have lived upon the work that other people did before me, oftentimes long before, and oftentimes in languages that I can't read, have to have translated for me. But there is this wonderful body of knowledge in the world, and it is available for any one of us who wants to probe into it.
A great library has not only books, but letters, manuscripts, and diaries, treasures for historian Barbara Tuchman.
I can't say that my work is based on primary sources only, but I always try to go back to them if possible. The first time I really extensively used primary material was when I did the Zimmerman telegram, I guess, using the material in the archives, National Archives in Washington. And that's all in the National Archives, which tells you a good deal about the importance and necessity of records like that, because they do hold the truth of history, and without them we'd never get at it.
Some people seem to think that the records of the past, books from distant times and remote places, ought to be of interest to the historian only. But that's not true. Every record of a past thought or of a distant place is a part of us, because it shows a possibility of humankind which we couldn't discover in our own city or in our own neighborhood. The library, therefore, is a laboratory of our memory and a catalyst of expectations. It's a place where we learn what we're capable of, and in ways that we could never learn from our friends and neighbors.
Where we stand is only the top layer of a series of cultures. Stone by stone, we can excavate down to the time, perhaps 10,000 years ago, when writing was unknown, and the only history was a painted bison in a limestone cave. So the great gems, far beyond any gold cup or hoard of stamped coins, are the words of man. Writing, the perishable record of language. Time, we tend to say, destroys alike the great and the trivial. But that's a lazy analysis. Not time, but flood, and fire, and war, and neglect. Of Sophocles' 123 plays, only 7 survive intact.
missing the bottoms, that these little strokes could be the bottom to the next line.
The treasures of 4,000 years of Egypt, reduced to mere fragments, bits of inscribed papyrus, a jigsaw puzzle, with most of it missing. Within a generation or two, our own books in our own libraries will look like this, unless we take heed.
Of a sentence. Someone said these pieces belong to the same papyrus, but do they, do we actually have any joins? And if so, can we now mount them so nobody will ever have to push these particular pieces around again?
Well, maybe those two pieces would go together.
That's possible. But we really should try to light and see if the fibers can be followed through. And
you can start with like a heavy line right there and see that they do match up.
Yeah, they do. So these two should really be mounted together.
This is truly a book that has died. There is nothing that we can do about it. No book conservator can preserve it. There's nothing that can be done because it's breaking out of the bindings. When you turn a corner, it breaks. In fact, we have to salvage this book some other way.
In universities and research libraries around the world, paper and its permanence have become the subject of intense study and discussion.
Rotted in the sun, or it was mixed with lime, which is alkaline, which gave a nice alkaline paper. It was stamped. People stamped it with their feet, or they beat it with sticks. Consequently, the resulting paper was beautiful, white, long-fibered paper. This is late 17th, early 18th century paper. It's beautiful paper. It has long fibers. It has a nice color. It's strong. And I will pass this around in a few minutes with a piece of brittle paper, and you can see the difference. So, early paper was beautiful.
With the invention of the printing press and the rapid spread of literacy, demand for paper became more and more severe. A never-ending search began for ways to make paper more quickly, more cheaply, and in larger amounts. As years passed, mechanical devices were introduced, and chemicals, such as alum, were added. Alum is acidic. It was the beginning of the real problem. By mid-19th century, when there weren't enough linen and cotton rags, the base for much early permanent paper, paper makers turned increasingly to wood, and more acidic chemicals were used. The acid became a slow-acting time bomb, set to go off in the last decades of the 20th century. Though the problem is now well known, even today, paper makers show too little concern, because only 1% of all the paper they make is used in the production of books.
Now, you can understand a little better why, if no other industry is concerned about acidic paper and paper deteriorating, why libraries and archives are voices calling in the wilderness saying, help us, this is terrible, when paper manufacturers are basically saying 1%. In other words, we don't have much economic clout. We have shelf life, as I mentioned earlier, on modern book paper of an average of 50 years. We're adding to the world's collection of research materials at a phenomenal rate, as you all know. Most of it published on trashy, awful paper. So not only do we have a problem from the past, we have a problem that we're adding to the future. And it's less excusable for us because we know about it. We know what we're doing. We know the paper is awful. Obviously, the question is, what can we do about it? What are we doing about it? Why aren't we doing something about it?
Well, until I came to the library, I had no idea about the major preservation and conservation problems inherent in libraries. I had just done what all the scholars did, use, and if you didn't find material good, complain, but never went to the core of it in order to see the paper, acidity in the paper, air pollution, atmospheric conditions, humidity, excess of heat, cheap glue, overuse, abuse. All of this were enemies of the book and enemies of the paper.
1966, Florence, a cruel and universal disaster. The river Arno rose 15 feet above its banks and scored its muddy signature on the white walls and treasures of Florence. National Library, there were stored in large stone rooms that could nevertheless not hold back the natural madness of a river, the greatest works of the Renaissance, a world treasure. The manuscripts of Dante and Boccaccio, the sonnets of Petrarch and Michelangelo, and the notebooks of Leonardo da Vinci. What happened in Florence shocked scholars around the world. Money and experts were flown to the sodden halls, so marked with river soil. And there began, little by little, the long effort to scrape away the stains. Two decades later, the job is still not finished. Patiently, page by page, we are being given back the treasure of the past and learning for the future how to preserve it. Was a warning bell, a prod, and a catalyst for the growing movement toward not merely collection, but preservation of the gifts of history. The Northeast Document Conservation Center in Andover, Massachusetts, one of several centers whose job, supported by money and talent from universities and foundations, is to develop techniques and train personnel to keep books and printed paper alive. Posters, documents, journals, maps, photographs, manuscripts, precious artifacts are lovingly restored by patient and dedicated workers.
I'm working on a piece of parchment. It is an indenture document that was prepared in 1670, so it's more than 300 years old.
You become very aware of the object, how it ages through time on a microscopic level as well as a broader sense. And basically, you begin to appreciate even smaller objects for their aesthetics as well as their content.
I'm working on children's books that have a lot of nice publishers' bindings from the Victorian period. There are all kinds of nursery rhymes and finger games and things like that that people were using with their children and teaching their children. A lot of things that we work on here are one-of-a-kind things. It makes me feel good to contribute to having these things around.
The center also focuses on preventive preservation.
My position here is to help curators and librarians take better care of their collections and basically to prevent damage and to actually keep things out of this facility. Here at the center, we can really only treat individual objects, the very best of objects in an institution, whereas curators and librarians have to deal with very large quantities of materials. I conduct on-site surveys of institutions, museums, libraries, historical organizations, town clerks' offices, and I examine the building from the point of view of how well the collections are protected. Another of my responsibilities is to provide assistance in case of disaster, fires and floods that affect library and archival collections. In the case of a major disaster, we're prepared to send somebody to the site and to assist on site. Probably the most common kinds of disasters are fires and floods, and there are different varieties of those. I mean, some of them are natural disasters. Fires are sometimes caused by arson, very frequently, probably most frequently by arson. For the great masses of collections, prevention is the key to their preservation.
But it is the slow fires, the acid embedded in the paper, that remain the greatest threat. Page by page, at considerable cost, a book may be deacidified by hand. Some books and other library materials are beyond any such process. To be saved, they must first be cut apart.
What we do at the center, and it's probably the only documents that we'll consider to guillotine, are newspaper collections, the kind that have been put in a giant volume to be stacked on the library shelf. If you wait too long filming a newspaper collection for a library, you may get to your shelves and find that the acid process has burnt your newspapers and they've deteriorated so bad that the pages cannot be turned. At this point, they're not able to be filmed. As you can tell from the color of the newspaper, they're turning brown and they're highly acidic. They're burning up. It kind of bothers me to guillotine newspaper collections because I know the actual papers are not going to go back on the shelves. But to contain the information on microfilm is the ideal way to preserve the newspapers so that the viewer will be able to see the construction of that newspaper and all the ads and all the articles and all the neat things of old newspapers.
To be saved, these printed materials must be transposed to another medium, of which the most common is microfilm.
Microfilming is important because it offers a cheap, or relatively cheap, way of preserving the informational content of the books. These books are not artifactually valuable in and of themselves, so that they do not warrant investing the $300 or $400 or $500 that it would take to preserve them as artifacts. What we want is the information that they contain. The only proven technology that we currently have available to us is microfilming. It's an old technology. It's been around in use since the mid-30s. And if it is properly done, and if the master negatives are properly stored, we know that those images will survive.